Sharp, intense pains surged through Leah's abdomen, causing her to collapse to the floor, struggling to breathe through the contractions. Eventually, the pain subsided, and she reached for the phone to dial Emmy's number. She didn't think she had much time left, and with the hospital being a half-hour drive away, she needed help urgently. "It's starting," she managed to gasp when Emmy picked up. "Don't worry, I'll be there right away," Emmy replied quickly. Leah couldn't respond. Another wave of pain hit her like a vice, and she dropped the phone onto the floor as she struggled to cope. By the time Emmy burst through the door, Leah could barely move. "Come on, Leah, we need to get you to the car. Where's your bag?" Leah weakly pointed to the kitchen, gasping for air. She attempted to stand but was hit by another contraction, closing her eyes as sweat streamed down her face. Emmy quickly grabbed the small bag and threw it over her shoulder. She was anxious, knowing how fast the contractions were coming, and feared they wouldn't make it to the hospital in time. Gently, she took Leah's arm and guided her toward the door. "Not far now, sweetie," she said encouragingly. "We'll get you comfortable at the hospital soon." "Good," Leah panted, clutching her belly again. "I just want this baby out." For a brief moment, her thoughts turned to him, but she pushed the thought away as quickly as it came. He had made his choice, and they both had to live with the consequences. Later, Emmy sat in the hospital corridor, her eyes fixed on a poster of a smiling baby. Nurses came and went, but there was no news. The magazine on her lap lay open, forgotten. It was impossible to focus on anything. Her mind was consumed with worry for Leah and the baby. By rights, it shouldn't have been her sitting here, waiting. But what choice did she have? She could hardly have let the poor girl deal with this alone. Leah had nobody else. She had no family, and the baby's father was not around. Not that Emmy really knew much about what had happened. Leah had stayed tight-lipped on the subject, merely saying, early on, that he wasn't going to be around. As much as it was none of her business, Emmy couldn't help but wonder what kind of man walked away from a woman who was carrying his baby. She just wished she could tell him what was happening. Maybe if he knew Leah was in trouble, he'd show up and everything would be okay. "Are you the woman who brought Leah Jackson in?" Emmy jumped, startled from her grim thoughts by the tall man standing before her. His white coat indicated he was one of the doctors, and his grave expression suggested all was not well. Her heart began to thud painfully in her chest. "Please God, let everything be okay." "Yes, I'm Emmy Donnelly," she replied quickly. "How is she? Could you come with me, please?" The doctor didn't wait for her to answer. He turned and strode off down the long corridor, and Emmy was forced to jog after him. He reached a door and pushed it open, indicating for Emmy to go into the room. She spun round. "Please, tell me what's happening." "It's not good news, I'm afraid. As you're aware, we had to perform an emergency cesarean. Unfortunately, there were unexpected complications, and despite all our efforts, we lost Leah." Emmy heard the words, but she didn't quite believe them. Surely this man was joking. Women didn't die in childbirth in this day and age, did they? She sat down abruptly, the shock knocking the stuffing out of her completely. "What about the baby?" she croaked. She could hardly comprehend that Leah was gone. It seemed surreal. She should be standing beside Leah's bed now, cooing over a baby while Leah beamed happily. Instead, she was having this bizarre conversation with a man who was telling her Leah was dead. "The baby is fine." Leah had a little girl. For the first time, the doctor allowed a faint smile to briefly illuminate his tired features. "Which brings me to my next question. Do you know who Leah's next of kin are? We'll need to contact them." "She doesn't have any." The doctor looked slightly taken aback. It obviously wasn't the answer he was expecting. "What about the baby's father?" "That's a difficult one," admitted Emmy. "I don't know much about him." She racked her brains, trying to think if Leah had given her any information over the last few months. The trouble was Emmy hadn't known Leah when she was seeing that man. She'd only moved into the street after she was pregnant and the relationship was over. Nothing at all. "If the baby's biological father is not on the scene, we'll have to call social services." "Look, let me see what I can find out." The doctor nodded. "Okay, but I'll still have to set things in motion." This was not the outcome he expected. To lose a patient was tragic enough, but to find out the baby was effectively an orphan was the worst-case scenario. He left Emmy sitting in the pale green room, still in shock. Days like this made him wish he'd studied art instead of medicine. Abruptly, his pager went off, alerting him to a fresh problem. Pushing the image of the dead girl from his head, he dashed back down the corridor. Mitchell silently washed the dishes as he stared unseeing out into the garden. The water was scalding hot, but he barely noticed. For some reason, he'd been thinking about Leah again. Despite the months that had passed since they parted, he hadn't really forgotten about her. Once, he'd tried ringing her mobile, but the number was no longer in use. He guessed she had met someone else by now. She was too pretty to be on her own for long. This was one of the reasons he hadn't tried contacting her when things changed. The thought of finding out she'd fallen in love with someone else was too painful. No, he had to accept that he'd blown it big time. It had been his own fault. Leah had given him every opportunity to choose her, but he'd been unable to do it. In the end, she'd given up on him and their relationship. At the time, it had felt like he had no choice but to cool things off for a while. Hazel's tearful announcement of her illness had rocked him to the core. To abandon his wife in her hour of need was not something he was capable of. He may have been a lousy husband, but even he wouldn't do something so callous. By the time he had discovered Hazel's betrayal, it was too late. He had desperately wanted to contact Leah, but she had moved house and changed her job, thus effectively cutting him out of her life. As much as it killed him, he realized that staying away from her was probably in her interests. He had hurt her enough, and he didn't want to cause her any more pain, had to respect her decision. He never intended to hurt Leah, but he couldn't give her what she needed. He had to be there for Hazel. Mitchell gripped the edge of the sink tightly. As he thought about Hazel and how he'd been duped, he still found it difficult to forgive her for what she'd put him through. She was lucky he hadn't killed her when he'd found out. Thinking back to that final time he saw Leah, he wished he'd known then what he knew now. He would have held her and never let her go again. But he hadn't. Instead, he'd lost the woman he loved. "I'm sorry, Leah," he had said sadly, as they stood beside his car the last time he'd seen her. "I love you, but I can't leave her now. She needs me. I need you too, Mitchell," she replied brokenly. Her pain cut him to the bone. It was his pain too. Silently, they held each other one last time. "Maybe when things are different," he tried to say, but it was no use. He was clutching at an invisible straw, and they both knew it. "Goodbye, Mitchell," she said sadly, a lone tear sliding down her pale cheek. Without further ado, she walked away and climbed into her car. Before Mitchell could stop her, she was gone, forever. Meanwhile, Emmy unlocked Leah's house and walked in. Dirty dishes were laid in the sink, and she noticed a vaguely stale smell lingering in the air. For a while she stood in the hallway, listening to the sound of silence. It was still difficult to comprehend that Leah wasn't coming back. Everywhere Emmy looked, there were reminders of her friend. A copy of Parents magazine was open on the sofa, a half-drunk mug of tea congealed on the table. Emmy perhaps imagined she could hear the radio playing pop tunes in the kitchen and Leah would appear at any moment, grinning as she produced a packet of chocolate biscuits for them to eat. But Leah wasn't ever coming home. The house would soon be cleared and offered to another tenant, and all traces of Leah would be gone. Apart from the baby she'd left behind. Emmy had been to see the baby that morning. She was tiny, a little doll in an oversized, stretchy suit. It almost broke her heart to see the infant in the crib, happily sucking away on her thumb as she slept, obliviously unaware that she was an orphan. Which was why Emmy had come back to the house. She felt certain there had to be something here that would give her a clue as to the whereabouts of the baby's father. Irrespective of what had gone wrong between them, Leah would have wanted him to know about the baby now that she was gone. The thought of Leah's baby ending up with foster parents, when she had a father somewhere, felt wrong. Emmy was determined to do all she could to help. She began to hunt through drawers in the dresser, trying not to think too much about how only a day earlier, Leah had sat in this very room, excited about the impending birth. It still felt unreal. When she found nothing of interest downstairs, Emmy moved on to Leah's bedroom. Now she felt really uncomfortable, like she was prying, but she kept reminding herself of the fact there was nobody else to look. Emmy was the closest thing Leah had had to family. There was a shoebox on the top shelf of the wardrobe. Standing on a chair, Emmy managed to reach it, and she carefully lifted it down. Inside, there were several letters, cards, and photographs. As soon as she glanced at them, she realized she'd found what she had been looking for. The first photograph showed a smiling Leah with a tall, dark-haired man. He had his arm draped around her shoulders as they stared into the lens of the camera. The picture appeared to have been taken a while ago because Leah looked younger. Her hair was much longer than it had been in the time Emmy knew her. The man appeared older than her friend, but they seemed happy in the picture. The next picture showed the man smiling as he sat beneath a huge tree. There were a couple more of him at the same place, then a final one of the two of them, arms wrapped around each other. Whoever he was, it seemed that it had been more than just a casual relationship. That much Emmy was certain. There were 3 Valentine's cards carefully placed in the box, each one cute and sentimental. No name inside, just a scrawled M and a few kisses. There were also a few handwritten notes, love letters for want of a better word. Emmy glanced at the words. It felt like an invasion of privacy to read such personal stuff. Since there was no real information in them, she started to put them to one side. The last sheet of paper caught her eye. It was a print out of an email conversation. From the content, it looked like it was one of the final pieces of correspondence between Leah and Mitchell. He appeared to be justifying his reasons for not ending his marriage in order to be with Leah. Emmy realized, then, why Leah had not wanted to discuss it. She'd been having an affair with a married man. Judging by the date on the emails, they were sent 9 months ago, which suggested Leah had ended the relationship around the time she fell pregnant. Had she even told him about the baby? It seemed now that there was a possibility she hadn't. The only positive side to these emails was that he had sent the messages from his work account. This gave Emmy a starting point to finding him. She now had his full name, Mitchell MacArthur, plus his company name. Assuming he hadn't changed his job, she should be able to contact him. Just what exactly she was going to say to the man was something she hadn't yet considered. Nevertheless, she felt she owed it to Leah and her baby to try to find this Mitchell. If he truly didn't want to know for whatever reason, then at least she'd done her best. Thereafter, it would be up to social services. Mitchell replaced the receiver on the phone and realized his hands were shaking. His whole life had just shifted on some invisible axis and nothing would ever be the same again. Would you like a cup of coffee, Mitchell? I'm just... Jenny, his PA, stopped dead when she saw his demeanor and the rest of her sentence was left hanging. He took a deep breath and tried to compose his thoughts. Judging from Jenny's continued look of concerned curiosity, his attempt to look normal wasn't working. No, I have to go out. Can you hold all my calls and cancel that meeting with Rod James? Tell him I'll reschedule for later in the week. Sure, no problem, Jenny said carefully. Is everything okay? No, not really, Mitchell said as he began to pack his briefcase hurriedly. He doubted it would ever be okay again. Jenny waited for him to elaborate on this intriguing statement. When he said nothing more, she gave up. When will you be back? No idea, he said. I'll call you later. He swept out of the office, oblivious to the discreet glances from the staff. The only thing on his mind was the news he had just been given. Emmy sat in the coffee shop wondering what the hell she was going to say to this stranger whose life she had just upended with the most catastrophic news. She supposed that she should be pleased he had even listened to her. For the first few moments, she had expected him to hang up, but he had been willing to listen when she mentioned Leah's name. For that she was grateful. She recognized him as soon as he strode through the door. He, on the other hand, had no idea who she was, so she stood, feeling a little self-conscious, and waved at him. Mitchell sat down and faced the petite dark-haired woman who had just dropped the biggest bombshell of his life on him. You must be Emmy, he said, for lack of anything better to say. And you must be Mitchell, Emmy replied with a ghost of a smile flickering across her face. I'm sorry to have to be the bearer of such news, she apologized, but I felt you had a right to know. Mitchell looked down at the table and studied the scratches in the worn pine surface. He sensed her sympathy, but he wasn't sure he deserved it. How did you find me? He was still mystified about that. Leah had kept some letters amongst other things. There was a print out of an email you'd sent her, and I found your telephone number through the company details. Can I fetch you a coffee? No, it's okay. I'll get it. Would you like another one? Mitchell needed a moment to collect his thoughts. This was all too much. Emmy shook her head. No, thanks, she replied. Too much caffeine is bad for me. He stood and joined the queue for drinks. For some reason, this reminded him of the many times he'd met Leah for coffee at lunchtime. When their affair first began, they had spent many hours talking over coffee. Short, stolen, blissful moments, all fitted in between meetings. The local coffee shop had been a refuge from all that was wrong with his life. Can I help you, sir? The blonde girl behind the counter repeated with an expression of irritation on her pretty face. Only then did he realize she had been impatiently waiting for his order. He hurriedly asked for an espresso. Once he had paid for the drink, he returned to Emmy and sat down again. He sipped the scorching hot coffee. How was she, before she, he broke off abruptly. The words just wouldn't come, no matter how much he tried to spit them out. Leah was good, Emmy said softly. She was happy and looking forward to the baby's coming. Tears welled up at the corners of her eyes. She fought to contain the tide of emotion that threatened to spill out from behind the carefully built wall of control. This wasn't about her. It was about the child. I didn't want things to end the way they did, Mitchell said slowly. He wasn't sure why he was justifying himself to this stranger, but he felt he had to explain. She never told me about the baby. Emmy reached out impulsively and covered Mitchell's hand. It felt cold despite the warm day. That's in the past now, she said gently. I'm not here to cast blame on anyone. I'm only trying to do the right thing for the baby. What's her name? He asked hesitantly, grateful for Emmy's empathy. The baby, I mean. She doesn't have one, but Leah liked the name Hope. She said it was fitting for her baby. Emmy wondered if she'd had some kind of premonition. That's a nice name, he said. Can I see her? Yes, if you want you. He knew there was no way on earth he could not see her now. She was all he had left. The shadows lengthened in the dark room as night fell. Still, Mitchell continued to sit, immobile in his worn leather armchair. A glass of scotch sat untouched on the table beside him. He was too lost in his memories. Hazel had rung earlier, ostensibly to chat about things, but he knew it was her way of checking up on him. Even from 3,000 miles away, she still felt the need to control his life. As he listened to her familiar voice echoing down the phone line, it was on the tip of his tongue to tell her everything. But self-preservation prevented him. It could wait until she returned to finalize their divorce in a few months' time. He had no desire to open Pandora's box too soon. Not that his life was any of her business anymore. Once he'd kicked her out, she had decided to travel and take some time to decide what she wanted from her life. In her own inimitable way, she had calmly stated that she no longer needed him, and now she wanted her freedom. He sometimes wondered why he had ever thought it was possible for things to change. How naive he had been. Duty and a sense of misguided loyalty had prevented him from seeking happiness with the woman he loved. And for what exactly? Now he was the one left with nothing. Well, almost nothing. He silently corrected himself. He had hope. If only Leah had told me, he thought miserably. Maybe then things would have been different. But she had said nothing. She had simply walked away from him that day. Of course, now he knew why. She must have known that if she had told him of her pregnancy, he would have felt utterly torn. He could still picture her face during those final moments, as she shook her head with sorrow. How he wished he could turn the clock back. If he knew then what he knew now, would it have made any difference? They would never know. He had made a terrible decision, and the die had been cast. Tomorrow, he would go and see his daughter. Despite the desolation he felt by knowing Leah was gone forever, a small flicker of hope burned deep within the barren wasteland of his heart. He had to be strong for hope. She needed him. The nursery was empty, but for the crib in the corner. Mitchell walked across the room, while Emmy stood near the door and watched. She still wasn't sure if this was going to work. What if he rejected the baby? Instinct told her he was a decent man, but who knew for sure? The social worker had certainly seemed pleased at the news that Hope did, in fact, have a father. Assuming Mitchell was willing to accept his responsibility, she had said Hope could be taken home as soon as he was ready. She would continue to monitor the baby, but she wasn't going to stand in Mitchell's way since he was the natural father. Emmy was rather relieved by this decision. She wasn't all that certain social services would be amenable to Mitchell's assuming parental responsibility. Fortunately for everybody, reason had prevailed for once. Hope was asleep. For what seemed like ages, Mitchell stood watching her, his face turned away from Emmy's gaze. She tried to relax, but the tension and emotion of the moment was almost unbearable. Part of her couldn't help but wonder if Leah was watching them all. Emmy hoped so. Yes, she really did. There was a small sound from the Perspex crib, followed by a muffled cry. Mitchell turned round, his face worried. "What do I do?" he asked. "You could try picking her up," replied Emmy with a smile. "She won't break." "But she's so tiny," marveled Mitchell. "Like a little doll. I've never seen anything so delicate." He seemed in awe. Emmy wondered if he had any idea of how much work was involved in looking after a baby. Emmy knew. She was the eldest of 7 children. That was probably why she'd made a subconscious decision not to have kids of her own. Besides, she hadn't met any man she considered worthy enough to father her children. She was resigned to the fact that she probably never would. Hope began to cry more vigorously. As Emmy considered intervening, Mitchell reached into the crib and gingerly picked her up. Immediately, she ceased her wailing. "Hello, Hope," he murmured almost inaudibly. Mitchell couldn't believe that this precious child in his arms came from him. It seemed impossible. She was far too perfect. Her wisps of blonde hair were like threads of gold, and her cornflower blue eyes reminded him of Leah. In fact, everything about her reminded him of Leah, from the sweet rosebud of her mouth to the way she looked at him unflinchingly, as if she could see right into his soul. For a second, he swore Leah was there, standing beside him, smiling at them both. Then the moment passed, and Hope yawned sleepily. "Does she want feeding?" he said. "I reckon the wee girl is hungry, yes." A stout nurse appeared through the door with a bottle of formula in her hand. "Here you are," she smiled as she passed the warm bottle to Mitchell. He must have looked stricken because the nurse chuckled. "I can see you're a novice at this." She grinned. "Here, this is how you do it." She showed him how to feed Hope. He was surprised to find that Hope had drunk every last drop of her milk in no time and was falling asleep contentedly. "Now, it's time to change that nappy," exclaimed the nurse gleefully, and Emmy couldn't help but laugh at Mitchell's horrified expression. The relief she felt was overwhelming. After the nightmarish last few days, it seemed like something positive might actually emerge from this unholy mess. If only Leah could witness this, she thought sadly. All she could hope for was that Leah was watching, somehow, somewhere. It was only when the telephone rang that Mitchell realized he'd nodded off again. He opened his bleary eyes and tried to focus on the small desktop clock. He had approximately 10 minutes before one of the directors was due to arrive for a monthly review meeting. As he sat wondering how on earth he was going to pull this meeting off, Ginny strolled in with a large mug of black coffee. "Here you go," she said kindly. "I was just about to come and wake you up. Mr. Clark is down in reception. I've managed to stall him, but apparently he is going to be up here very shortly." "Thanks, Ginny," Mitchell said gratefully. He sometimes wondered what he would have done without his loyal PA. She had saved his bacon several times recently. "Rough night again?" Ginny asked sympathetically, noting the dark circles beneath his eyes. "You could say that." Mitchell smiled ruefully. Hope had cried every night for the last fortnight. It seemed to be colic, or so he had decided after consulting umpteen childcare books. But whatever it was, the end result was little or no sleep for either of them. Despite these problems, he wouldn't have given up his little girl for all the sleep in the world. Smiling fondly, he sipped the scalding coffee as Ginny quickly tidied his meeting table and scurried off to make some tea for their guest. "You're looking tired," commented John Clark when he strode into the office. "Oh, you know how it is," replied Mitchell airily. The last thing he wanted was for John to think he wasn't up to the job anymore. With Hazel demanding ever more money, he needed every penny he could earn. "I can vaguely remember," John agreed dryly. "It seems like a lifetime ago since my girls were babies. How are you coping?" Despite the seemingly caring question, Mitchell knew very well that with any hint of falling apart, the vultures would descend for the final kill. His second-in-command, Sam Brown, had been snapping at his heels for weeks now, and Mitchell was loath to lose his job to him. "I'm coping well, John. Thanks for asking," he said breezily. "Now, about that report you wanted to discuss, I have 2 copies here, and as soon as Ginny brings the tea in, we can get on with it." John nodded. He seemed reassured by Mitchell's confident manner. "Excellent stuff. I'm looking forward to seeing what innovative proposals you have managed to come up with." Inwardly, Mitchell breathed a sigh of relief. He just hoped that the meeting wouldn't drag on too long. He needed to collect Hope from the childminder before 6. Emmy threw some tins in her trolley and listened to the wail of a small child somewhere in the vicinity. She smiled to herself. It was times like this that she knew not having children had been the right decision. As much as she loved her nieces and nephews, she was also rather glad to hand them back at the end of visits. Sitting in front of the television with a packet of biscuits and a glass of wine wasn't everyone's idea of an exciting evening, but it suited her just fine. She still missed Leah. She had new neighbors now, but apart from polite words here and there, she hadn't made any effort to make friends with them. They were a young couple. It had broken her heart when she first saw the removal van pull up outside the small terrace house. The sight of strangers carrying in boxes and pieces of worn furniture only reinforced the knowledge that Leah was truly gone for good. She had cried herself to sleep that night. Pushing the awkward trolley with its wonky wheel round the corner, Emmy grabbed a packet of cereal and decided to call it a night. She was tired, and there would be something interesting on the television soon. The wailing she'd just heard suddenly increased in volume, and she found another trolley in her path. A man was trying to comfort a small baby unsuccessfully. "Would you mind moving?" she asked politely when she realized she wouldn't be able to pass until he moved. "Oh, sorry," the man apologized. It was Mitchell. He looked at her blankly for a second, before the realization sank in. "Is it Emmy?" he asked. "Leah's friend?" She smiled warmly. "Yes. How are you?" She hadn't seen him since the funeral. The memory of that cold, miserable day made her shudder. They had stood amongst a straggle of strangers whilst Leah's coffin was lowered into the dark earth. It was not a day she hoped she would ever have to repeat. "I soldier on," he grinned. "It would help if somebody would shut up for 5 minutes." Hope continued to wail miserably as he rubbed her back. Emmy glanced into his trolley. "Have you got much more to buy?" she asked. "No, why?" "Well, I've finished, so if I chuck my stuff in the end of your trolley and push this, you can carry Hope to the checkout. It might make things easier." Mitchell looked at her with relief. He knew Hope preferred being carried to lying in her seat. It wasn't as if she was hungry, or else she just wanted the comfort of his arms. "It's a deal," he replied gratefully. By the time they had passed through the checkout, Hope had quietened down. She stared at Emmy through damp lashes, and Emmy felt her heart melt a little. She really was an adorable baby. No doubt she'd break a few hearts when she was all grown up. "Where's your car?" asked Mitchell when they left the brightly lit supermarket. "In the garage again." Emmy scowled as she thought about her green Fiat. That car was the bane of her life these days. "I'll catch the bus home." No. We can drop you off if you like." "Are you sure? It might be miles out of your way." Emmy told him where she lived and hoped it was on his way home. Her feet were killing her, and she didn't relish a long wait for a bus. "I'd be happy to drop you off," Mitchell confirmed. "My car is just over there." He pointed to a black BMW and began to push the trolley towards it. Emmy thanked her lucky stars as she surveyed the long queue for a bus and gratefully jogged after him, her plates bouncing jauntily. "Thanks so much for the lift," Emmy said, as Mitchell pulled up outside her small, terraced house. "No problem," he smiled. "It was nice to see you again." And he meant it. Emmy had obviously been a good friend to Leah, and he had regretted not taking her telephone number after the funeral. But then again, it hadn't exactly been on his mind at the time. All he had wanted to do, then, was go home and grieve in solitude. He had an idea. Perhaps Hope and I could treat you to a coffee in the park one Sunday? Emmy looked surprised for a moment before her face broke out in a warm smile. That would be lovely, she grinned. How about this Sunday? Is 11 o'clock all right for you? Emmy thought about it for a moment. Did she have anything urgent planned for Sunday morning? Housework didn't really count, so no. 11 o'clock is fine with me. Shall I meet you by the bandstand? Okay, bandstand it is. Hope and I look forward to it. They both grinned at each other before Emmy jumped out of the car and retrieved her bag of shopping. By Hope, she said softly, as the baby cooed at her happily. She shut the car door, and Mitchell drove off down the street. He was feeling more cheerful than he had for a while. It would be good to spend some time with another adult on his weekends. As much as he adored Hope, sometimes he felt very isolated. It was only now that he appreciated how difficult it was being a single parent. Most of his friends had drifted away since he had assumed responsibility for Hope. He was well aware of what they were saying behind his back, but he didn't care. The only thorn in his side was Hazel. His estranged wife was currently trekking through Belize and was, therefore, out of contact. As far as he was concerned, that at least was a blessing. But it wouldn't be forever. He was certain that one of their friends would have enlightened her about his situation via email before he had the chance to talk to her. She was unlikely to be a happy woman once the truth came out. Oh no, he wasn't exactly looking forward to that particular conversation. The sun was struggling to peek through the gray clouds as Emmy strolled down the concrete path towards the bandstand. She was rather looking forward to spending some time with Hope. Mitchell, too, if she was brutally honest. She could well understand what Leah saw in him. Had seen. She mentally corrected herself. He was attractive in a gruff kind of way, but what did it for Emmy was the quiet way he spoke and acted. Of course, this was just a friendship, nothing more. If it meant she also got to spend time with Hope, then she was happy. It pleased her to know she might be able to watch Hope grow up. If Leah still were here, Emmy would have been the little girl's adoptive aunt. You'll be the one taking her to the pub as soon as she's old enough. Leah laughed at the look of horror on Emmy's face. Oh, come on. It's more likely that she'll be showing me how it's all done. They both thought about the prospect that this baby Leah was carrying might one day morph into a Britney Spears clone, and Leah grimaced. Scary, Leah said out loud. I've changed my mind. Convent education it is. Good luck. Emmy grinned. It was still hard to come to terms with the realization that Leah would never see her little girl become a young woman, perhaps marry and have children of her own. Tears pricked Emmy's eyes at the unfairness of it all. Hey there. Mitchell's voice interrupted her silent reverie, and she realized he stood across her path with Hope in her pram. Sorry, I was miles away, Emmy apologized. I was just thinking about. She stopped abruptly. Now is not the time for such maudlin thoughts. That's okay, Mitchell said quietly. Emmy looked at him through damp lashes and had the uncanny sense that he knew exactly what she had been thinking about. It was most unsettling. She brushed the sensation to one side and determinately pasted a neutral expression on her face. They wandered over to the small cafe near the bandstand and sat down at one of the empty tables. It was a bright morning and fairly cool. Most people had taken tables inside the cramped building, so the outside seating was pretty deserted. Despite her lingering sense of sadness, Emmy was glad she had made the effort to come. She felt positive for the first time in a while. Can I hold her? She asked when Mitchell unstrapped Hope and lifted her out of the pram. Of course, he said. I'll go and fetch the coffees. Hope gazed up with huge blue eyes as she was lying in the curve of Emmy's arm. Small wisps of blonde hair curled in little ringlets, and she resembled a tiny cherub, peaceful and angelic. Don't be fooled by that innocent demeanor, chuckled Mitchell as he returned and placed a tray on their table. She's never that sweet at 3 a.m. I can well imagine, Emmy giggled. I have 7 younger siblings. Connor, the third youngest, was born when I was 11. He had the most awful colic and spent months screaming all night, every night. My parents were on the verge of divorce by the time he stopped all the crying. It was no fun. She pulled a face as she thought back to the horrific nights of no sleep. No, it's not much fun, said Mitchell with great understatement. But it won't last forever. True, agreed Emmy. But then you have teenage tantrums to look forward to instead, she added, recalling the conversation she'd had with Leah. A convent education is the answer to that, said Mitchell. That's exactly what Leah said. Mitchell looked shaken, and Emmy wished she hadn't said it. It was painfully obvious he hadn't yet dealt with everything that had happened. Sorry, she said gently. I'm horribly tactless at times. No, it's okay. He leant forward and sipped his coffee. I do need to talk about things, he said after a moment of silence. It's difficult, you know? I do know, Emmy replied. They both looked away, lost in their own recollections of the woman who'd brought them together. Then hope began to grizzle, and the moment passed. "I think somebody is ready for a feed," Mitchell said. "I'll just nip in and see if they can warm her bottle up." Emmy watched him walk across towards the cafe and thought again how attractive he was. Once again, she reminded herself that he was off limits even if he and his wife were separated. The last thing either of them needed was any romantic complications to be added to this situation. He came back out through the double doors, and Emmy quickly looked down at Hope, conscious that she'd been staring. She hoped he hadn't noticed. Fortunately, Hope decided to start wailing the moment Mitchell sat down, and so his attention was diverted. This allowed Emmy a chance to remember why she was there, and it wasn't to make any more unsuitable attachments. She had had enough of those to last a lifetime. As nice as Mitchell seemed, it was worth remembering that he had hurt Leah badly and been unfaithful to his wife in the process. That was hardly the kind of man she needed to fall for. Oh no, she told herself firmly as she watched him patiently coax Hope to take milk from the bottle. She needed a man like that as much as she needed a hole in her shoe. They chatted about mundane things whilst Hope finished her feed. Eventually, it was time to move and Mitchell strapped a grizzling baby back in her pram. "She's tired," he commented. "She's not the only one," replied Emmy dryly, noting the gray circles beneath Mitchell's eyes. He laughed. "Sleep is a luxury these days. You know," said Emmy after a moment's thought, "I don't mind babysitting if you ever need a break." Mitchell looked surprised. "I'm sure you must have loads of better things to do in your spare time." Emmy shrugged. "Not particularly. I don't go out that often. Besides, I'd like to see more of Hope if you don't mind. I thought you'd have men queuing up to take you out." He grinned at her, and Emmy felt a slow, warm sensation creeping through her body. "Hardly." She smiled self-deprecatingly and willed her cheeks not to flush. "Well, I'm sure Hope would love to see more of you, so consider your offer likely to be taken up imminently. You'll have to give me your phone number, and then I can ring you." Emmy pulled a scrap of paper from her bag and jotted the number down before handing it to Mitchell. Their fingers briefly touched, and she, once again, felt a sharp zing of attraction. They said their goodbyes, and Emmy walked away towards the south entrance of the park. She almost wished she hadn't offered to babysit. As much as she wanted to spend time with Hope, she had the feeling that her attraction to Mitchell was going to be dangerous. But it was too late now. She could hardly revoke her offer, so the ball was firmly in his court. Mitchell replaced the phone in its cradle and swore loudly. Hope was lying in her rocker chair nearby. Her eyes widened at the flood of foul language. "Shut your ears, Hope," Mitchell told her. "Daddy's just mad, but not at you." The baby cooed and waved her rattle at him, and he smiled, the tension fading somewhat. He was still left with a problem, however. Tonight, he was meant to be wining and dining a potential client and his wife, who were currently over from Tokyo. It was an important evening. This client could be a vital asset to the company. Moreover, it had been implied that if he didn't win the contract, he might be sidelined very soon. He knew his job was in a precarious position. Certain individuals were waiting, hopefully, for him to screw up big time. Therefore, he had no choice but to attend this dinner. Unfortunately, his childminder had let him down. She had promised it was no problem to take Hope for a few hours. Nevertheless, she had rung up half an hour ago to apologetically explain that she had a viral stomach bug and was, therefore, in no position to babysit. Now, he didn't know what the hell he was going to do. Shit. He thought quickly about whom else he could possibly ask. It was difficult, as most of his friends had pretty much written him off lately. Then, an image of Emmy popped into his head, and he grabbed his mobile to retrieve the number he had programmed in. "Hi, Emmy," he said in a rush when she answered her phone. "It's Mitchell here. Remember that babysitting you offered?" She listened, as he explained the predicament he was in. "Sure, no problem," she said. "Give me your address, and I'll be straight over." She was true to her word, duly arriving within half an hour with a small carrier bag in her hand. "Sorry, I couldn't resist when I saw this the other day," she explained, sheepishly pulling out a pretty outfit for Hope. Sitting down on the rug beside Hope, she looked around the spacious room curiously. It was tastefully decorated in beige tones, but it felt a little impersonal. She wasn't sure why exactly, but the lack of any family photos was strange. "I shouldn't be too late," explained Mitchell, while trying unsuccessfully to fasten his gold cuff links in a hurry. He swore softly when they refused to close. "Here, let me do it," said Emmy without thinking. She calmly fastened them for him and then straightened his tie. He suddenly looked at her properly for the first time since she'd arrived at his house. Her dark hair was pulled back into a ponytail, and she wore no makeup. She was dressed casually in scruffy jeans and a loose sweatshirt, yet she managed to look appealing to him. With a start, Mitchell realized how pretty she was. Up until this moment, his only perception of her had been that she was Leah's friend. Now, he began to see her as an attractive woman. It was unsettling. "Is everything okay?" She asked curiously. Belatedly, he realized he had been staring at her. He pulled back hurriedly. Yeah, thanks, he said a bit gruffly. Hell, I better go, or I'm going to be late. Are you sure you'll be all right? Feeds are in the fridge, and help yourself to anything you want. We'll be fine, won't we, Hope? Emmy said soothingly. Hope gurgled as if agreeing with her. She kicked her chubby little legs about, and Mitchell relaxed slightly. The taxi beeped its horn outside. Okay, I'm off now. He grabbed his jacket and house keys. Ring me, if you have any problems. He was suddenly anxious to leave. Emmy made him nervous for some strange reason. She, once again, assured him she would be fine, and so he left, aware that if he didn't ask the taxi driver to put his foot down, he would probably miss the starter. Emmy locked the door behind him. She wondered why Mitchell had looked at her funny when she fastened his cufflinks. She shook her head, dismissing the errant thought as Hope began to cry. It was time to fetch a bottle of milk from the kitchen. Mitchell walked in through his front door expecting to hear an all-too-familiar wailing. Instead, the house was silent but for the muted sound of the television in the living room. His head was slightly woolly from too much wine, and he could feel a headache coming on rapidly. Apart from eating and drinking too much, the evening hadn't gone too badly. The client had seemed receptive to his proposals, and he felt fairly sure that at least some business might be heading their way soon. Time would tell. At this moment, he didn't give a toss in all honesty. He was beginning to think that there was far more to life than work. After putting his shoes and coat away, he headed down the hall, towards the living room to see Emmy. For some reason, she had appeared in his thoughts with alarming regularity all evening, and he still wasn't sure why. God knew he had enough on his plate without adding a relationship into the potent mix. The room was in semi-darkness when he walked in. The lamp in the corner had been switched on, but the only other light was from the television. Emmy was curled up on the sofa, her legs tucked beneath her in a cat-like fashion. Mitchell was about to say something, when he realized she was fast asleep. She looked so young lying there with her hair spread out across the cushions, certainly nowhere near the 30-something he knew she was. He bent down and gently shook her shoulder, catching a faint wisp of floral perfume. She stirred a little and opened her eyes blearily, looking slightly confused for a moment. Then, she suddenly realized where she was. Oh God, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to fall asleep. She apologized. Her cheek was pink and creased where the edge of the cushion had left its mark. Mitchell felt his eyes drawn there, assailed by a sudden urge to rub the area with his thumb. He looked away quickly and examined what was playing on the television. Have I missed anything interesting? He asked politely, a slow throbbing headache beginning to bite right behind his temple. No, not really. Once Hope settled, I switched it on, but I guess I zonked out almost immediately. She rubbed her eyes ruefully. Did she go down all right? Hope seemed the safest subject to talk about while he was feeling this way. Emmy stood. She was great, didn't give me any bother. Mitchell was amazed. Really? He said in disbelief. Really? I bathed her, fed her, and then read some stories while she lay in her cot. She nodded off quite quickly. Maybe it's me then, he said, tiredness suddenly hitting him hard. It was horribly disheartening to hear that the baby who screamed the place down nightly had been an absolute angel for somebody else. Hey, don't be silly. Anyone can see you're doing a wonderful job in very difficult circumstances. Mitchell raised one eyebrow skeptically. You think? Yes, I do think, she replied firmly. Then why do I feel so useless half of the time? Emmy must have seen his dejected expression, for she stepped close and gave him an impulsive hug, throwing her arms around his neck in sympathy. The gesture took Mitchell completely by surprise. Her slight body pressed against him, and her hair tickled his nose for a few precious seconds. Almost without his realizing, his hands moved to hold her, but she jumped away abruptly with a stricken look. I'm so sorry, she apologized, her cheeks flushing deep pink with embarrassment. I shouldn't have done that. Mitchell reached forward and grasped her arm. Don't be sorry, I'm glad you did. He rubbed his temple, as he tried to find the right words through the fog that threatened to close his brain down for the night. It's been a while since anybody hugged me, he admitted. He was aware that he sounded deeply tragic, but suddenly did not care all that much. Emmy's face registered empathy and something else he couldn't fathom. He just hoped it wasn't pity. He couldn't cope with that at the moment. Me too, she admitted with a sad smile. I spent the last decade married to the Ice Queen. What's your excuse? Mitchell found it difficult to believe that this lovely woman didn't have a boyfriend. Bad luck, I guess. She shrugged. There was somebody, but it didn't work out, and, well, I haven't bothered looking since. Anyway, I'm talking rubbish. You must be shattered and I should get home. Sleep deprivation is a way of life. Emmy grabbed her bag and coat. Take advantage of the peace then. She grinned, and Mitchell felt relieved that the awkwardness of the previous few minutes appeared to have vanished. Thanks, for tonight, Mitchell said as they stood on the threshold of his front door. Outside, the sky was clear, Hundreds of twinkling stars were visible despite the glow from the street lamps. That's okay, Emmy said. It was my pleasure. Anytime you need me, just holler. How about next Saturday night? The words were out before Mitchell had a chance to think it through. Emmy had turned to go, but she paused in response to Mitchell's invitation. Do you have to work again? She asked. No, I just wondered if you fancied coming over and having some tea with us. She hesitated. Mitchell thought for a horrible moment that he'd overstepped the mark, but then she smiled and he exhaled with relief. Sure, she said, I'd love to. Great. Is 6 o'clock okay? I know it's early, but I don't want to keep Hope up too late. No, that's fine. Is there anything you need me to bring? Absolutely nothing. Okay, I'll see you on Saturday. She disappeared down the drive towards her parked car. Mitchell watched until she had safely driven away. He couldn't help wondering what had prompted the invitation. It hadn't been his intention at all. But, he reasoned, Hope liked Emmy and he sure as hell needed some adult company outside of the office. Emmy was fun to be around, and there was nothing wrong with them becoming friends. He firmly dismissed any nagging doubts as to his motives and headed off to bed, hoping that he might grab a few uninterrupted hours of sleep before Hope awoke again. Emmy jumped off the bus and looked up at the leaden sky dubiously. Judging by the black clouds congregating right above her head, it was about to tip it down. Just marvelous when my car is in the garage for the millionth time this month, she thought crossly. Catching buses was all very well, but Mitchell's house was not on a main bus route. She knew he would have picked her up if she'd asked him, but she was much too proud to ask. As large spats of water began to rain down on her, she soon regretted her decision. By the time she arrived on his doorstep, her carefully styled hair was dripping and she was under no illusions that she looked in any way hot. Mitchell looked suitably horrified when he opened the door and saw her disheveled state. Hurriedly stepping to one side, he gestured for Emmy to step inside the hall. Please don't tell me you walked here in this. He looked past her at the rain that was now sheeting it down and firmly closed the door on it. Kind of, she said cagily, realizing that he was probably going to shout at her. My car's in the garage again, so I caught the bus. Why? I'd have picked you up. I didn't want to put you to any trouble. Well, too late. Now you're dripping all over my expensive wooden floor, and it's not looking great. He shook his head in mock disapproval, then grinned at her to show he was joking. Seriously though, you can't stay in those wet clothes. I'll go grab something dry for you to change into. You can toss your things in the tumble dryer. He left Emmy standing in the hallway, feeling a bit awkward and out of place. As she glanced around and silently wished she'd just taken a taxi, she heard a baby crying. Following the sound, she stepped into the kitchen. Hope was lying in a rocker chair, sniffling sadly. Shoo, Emmy said gently. The baby stopped crying and broke into a bright smile. You just wanted some attention, didn't you? Emmy said, laughing softly. Isn't she just? Mitchell replied dryly. He handed Emmy a pile of clothes. These will probably be a bit big, but at least they're dry. You remember where the bathroom is? Emmy accepted the clothes. Yeah, thanks, and I'll try not to leave puddles everywhere. She gave Hope a little wave and headed up to the guest bathroom on the first floor. Inside, she closed the door and looked over the clothes. The shirt looked like one of Mitchell's, oversized and soft, and the cotton trousers, clearly meant for a woman, were a bit too big and long on her. Still, she got changed without fuss, thinking that comfort mattered more than style at the moment. Oh well, she thought, it's not like this is a big event or anything. Mitchell likely didn't care how she looked anyway. She picked up her wet clothes and made her way back downstairs, following the comforting aroma of food cooking. Her stomach rumbled as she stepped into the warm kitchen. Mitchell was at the stove, stirring a pot. The tumble dryer's through there, he said, pointing to a door. Just toss your clothes in. It won't take long. I hope you're not a vegetarian or anything, he added as she loaded the dryer and fiddled with the settings. Nope, definitely not, she called back. Satisfied the dryer didn't need monitoring, Emmy returned to the kitchen. Here, have some wine since you're not driving, Mitchell said, handing her a glass of red wine. She took a cautious sip. Usually she didn't drink much, especially wine, but this one was surprisingly good, certainly better than the bargain bottles she'd tried before. What are you cooking? Emmy asked curiously, as he pulled a tray of bread out of the oven. Pasta bolognese, he said with his back to her. Even I can't go wrong with that. Emmy laughed. I'm sure you're a better cook than I am. She grinned, taking another large gulp of the wine. This really is good, she thought with enjoyment. I doubt that, Mitchell replied dryly. Light music played in the background. As they chatted easily, Mitchell finished concocting his pasta sauce. Eventually, he threw the spaghetti in a pan of boiling water and poured himself another glass of wine. Refill? He asked when he saw Emmy had finished hers too. Yes, please, this wine is lovely. Expensive wine always tastes better, he told her with a grin. Right, the pasta is almost ready, so we can eat assuming there are no interruptions from a certain demanding young lady. They both looked sideways at Hope, who was currently entertaining herself with a toy. She smiled back at them innocently. Gaga gaga. Butter wouldn't melt, eh? Mitchell said with a laugh. Dinner passed uneventfully. Hope seemed happy to watch and listen to the conversation that flitted between work, films, and other light topics. As much as Emmy was curious to find out more about Mitchell's life, she was loath to ask any questions that might have been deemed too personal. Only once did he mention his estranged wife. It's from Hazel. She's in Cuba at the moment, he said when Emmy commented on the postcard that sat beside the microwave. When's she back? Asked Emmy, thinking that it must be nice to flit around the world unhindered by things like money and responsibilities. She didn't understand why the wife whom Mitchell was divorcing felt the need to send him postcards. It was completely incomprehensible. No idea, Mitchell said a little sharply. Probably when she has run out of cash. Emmy decided not to mention Hazel again. It was clearly a sore subject. Shall I wash the dishes? She asked lightly, wishing she had kept her mouth shut. No, I have a dishwasher, but thanks anyway. Feeling superfluous, Emmy went back into the living room and sat with Hope until Mitchell reappeared. I need to put Hope down now, he said. If I leave her any longer, she'll be beyond tired. Let me do that while you sit down, Emmy suggested kindly. The dinner had been lovely, and she felt the need to help in some small way. Besides, her head was rapidly becoming fuzzy after 3 glasses of wine. I know where everything is, and Hope settled for me last time. Sure, if you don't mind, Mitchell replied gratefully. He flopped down on the sofa and poured the rest of the wine into their glasses. No, of course I don't mind. She picked the baby up and took her upstairs. When eventually Hope was settled, Emmy came back downstairs to find Mitchell watching television. Everything okay? He asked quickly. Yeah, fine, Emmy said reassuringly. She glanced at her watch and realized that time was running away with her. Listen, thanks for the dinner, it's been really nice, but I ought to go now. I'm sure you would like some peace and quiet. Mitchell looked surprised. You don't need to rush off yet, do you? He said. Stay a while and keep me company, unless you have something important to do. Only ironing, she replied. He patted the sofa beside him. Then, take a seat, and I'll see what films are on. Emmy decided not to argue. She wasn't really in a rush to go home anyhow. It was the first evening in ages that she'd had company. Although she had plenty of friends who regularly invited her out, since Leah's death, she hadn't made much of an effort. Here, drink this, and then I'll go open another bottle. He passed over her glass, and Emmy took it warily. She wasn't sure that drinking any more wine was such a great idea. The last thing she needed was to make a complete fool of herself. But she drank it anyway. It was too good to waste. The leather sofa was very comfortable, and Emmy sank back into the cushions. The loose trousers she'd been loaned felt a little tighter around the waist now that she'd eaten a huge portion of pasta, but the shirt still gaped open. In fact, it gaped open rather a lot. When she happened to glance down during the commercial break, she realized to her embarrassment that half of her cleavage was exposed. Thankfully, Mitchell didn't appear to have noticed. The film was engaging, but the wine was making Emmy feel drowsy, and her focus began to drift. Mitchell seemed fully absorbed in the movie, so she let her gaze rest on him for a moment. He looked relaxed in jeans and a casual sports tee, comfortable, at ease. Even through her sleepiness, Emmy noticed how natural and calm he seemed, and she found that comforting. He rubbed his leg absent-mindedly and took another sip of wine. Emmy's attention followed the movement without much thought, noting how he carried himself with quiet strength. He clearly stayed active, she thought, and there was something reassuring about that. Just then, Mitchell turned toward her and asked if she wanted anything else to eat. She realized she'd been staring and quickly looked away, her cheeks flushing. No. Thanks, she replied, coughing slightly and taking another sip of wine to steady herself. But I will just nip to the bathroom while the adverts are on. The room suddenly felt close, and she welcomed the break. While I'm up, I'll check on Hope, she added. Okay, said Mitchell. I'm going to make some coffee. Want a cup? Yes, please, Emmy replied as she stood, a little unsteady. Black, no sugar, she added, thinking it might help clear her head. When she returned to the living room, the coffee was waiting on the table and the film had resumed. She took a grateful sip, a bit too quickly, and winced. Careful, it's hot, Mitchell said, raising an eyebrow at her reaction. Hope's fast asleep, Emmy said with a nod, settling in again. He nodded and returned to watching the film. The final climactic scenes were playing on screen, but although Emmy tried to pay attention, she found her gaze drawn back to Mitchell repeatedly. His profile was perfect, she decided. Straight nose and strong jawline. His hair needed a cut, but apart from that, he looks pretty damned hot, she thought wistfully. It was a pity she wasn't interested in him. When the credits finally began to roll, Emmy stood hurriedly. It was high time she rang for a taxi. Any longer, and she was in danger of drooling. She needed to change back into her clothes and leave, now, before she said or did anything she might regret. But before she had a chance to tell him her plan, Mitchell grabbed the 2 empty mugs and disappeared into the kitchen. Feeling wrong-footed, Emmy glanced around the room, but there was no sign of a telephone she could use. While she had her mobile in her bag, the battery was virtually dead, and the chances were good that if she tried to make a call, it would die completely. Anyway, she needed to retrieve her clothes first. She could ask to use the phone after she had changed. Wishing she hadn't drunk quite so much wine, Emmy walked a little unsteadily toward the kitchen. She didn't see the small plastic toy left on the floor, and when her foot caught it, she stumbled slightly, falling forward right into Mitchell's arms as he reappeared. "Hey, careful," he said, catching her around the waist with ease. "Aya." She stared into his eyes and felt her thoughts scatter. Something unspoken passed between them, and before she could process it, they were kissing. It was spontaneous, unplanned, and left her dizzy with surprise. She knew it wasn't a good idea, but the alcohol dulled her sense of caution. He smelled of coffee and something else that was familiar, warm, and comforting. Emmy couldn't remember the last time someone had made her feel this alive. They moved slightly, and she bumped into the edge of the sofa, losing her balance and landing on the cushions. Mitchell landed beside her. Her mind felt foggy, and for a few fleeting moments, she let herself be pulled into the intensity of the moment, unsure of where it was headed but unable to pull away. Mitchell lay next to her, both of them silent now. She ran her hands over his back, just to reassure herself he was real and close. Eventually, the moment passed. Mitchell reached behind them and pulled a blanket down from the back of the sofa. They lay there, both quiet, wrapped in a shared silence, until sleep took them. A few hours later, Mitchell woke. For a minute, he couldn't figure out where he was. A blanket was draped over him, and he felt a chill in the air. From somewhere in the house, he heard Hope crying. As the haze lifted, he remembered. The sofa beside him was empty. Emmy was gone. With a groan, he shut his eyes again. What had just happened? That hadn't been part of any plan. He had never intended to blur the lines like that with Emmy. Hope's cries grew louder. With a tired sigh, he pushed himself up. After pulling his clothes back on, he headed into the kitchen to prepare a bottle. Now wasn't the time to overthink anything. He was too tired. Maybe tomorrow it would all make sense, though he doubted it. "I'm coming, Hope," he muttered as he made his way upstairs. The text on his computer screen kept blurring as Mitchell stared at it in a zombie-like fashion. Eventually, he cursed and pushed the keyboard away. He returned to staring at his mobile instead. The house was blissfully silent. Hope was asleep upstairs, and he was meant to be writing yet another report for tomorrow's meeting. Instead, he sat at the table, unable to write the goddamn thing. He knew he needed to talk to Emmy, but he didn't know what he could say that would make things right. It wasn't that he hadn't enjoyed last night, but the fact that she'd left in the middle of the night indicated to him that she saw it as a huge mistake. Now, he felt like a total scumsucker for taking advantage of her when she was drunk. It had never been his intention to be anything other than friends with her. Despite the simmering attraction between them, he wasn't ready for a relationship. There were too many complications in his life right now, not least of them Hazel. He just hoped that he hadn't blown things with Emmy completely. It was obvious how much she adored Hope. He sighed. It was now or never. If he didn't make some kind of effort to make amends, then he would lose his nerves, and so would Emmy. Picking up his mobile, he dialed her home number. It rang and rang. Eventually, an answering service picked up the call, and a disembodied voice told him to leave a message after the tone. "Hi, Emmy, it's Mitchell. We need to talk about things. Can you give me a call, please?" He hung up, feeling awkward and uncertain like a confused teenager. If she didn't return his call, he didn't know what he'd do. Emmy sat on her sofa, listening to Mitchell's voice on her answering machine. She let out a shaky breath as the message ended. Just hearing his voice stirred something in her. She couldn't deny she had strong feelings for him. But last night had been a huge mistake. She knew at the moment she woke up from a brief sleep, still curled beside him. Her head was clear now, and the weight of her actions pressed heavily on her. Mitchell had been Leah's partner, there was no changing that. Leah might be gone, but Emmy still felt a deep loyalty to her memory. Whatever had happened between her and Mitchell, it wasn't right. She had to put a stop to it before it went any further. Frustrated, she punched the sofa cushions. How had she let things get this far? She silently vowed never to touch wine again. She was grateful Mitchell had stayed asleep when she gently eased herself away from him and left. That had been the hardest part, walking away. His embrace had felt comforting, safe. But she couldn't stay. She knew that. After quietly gathering her things, she slipped out into the cold night. She locked the door behind her and slid the key through the letterbox. The long walk into town felt like a fitting consequence for her lapse in judgment. By the time she flagged down a taxi, the hour was late, and all she wanted was to go home and forget the night ever happened. Even then, sleep eluded Emmy. Not until the sun peeked over the line of trees behind her house did she finally drift off. But it wasn't a particularly restful sleep, as arousing images of their love making continued to haunt her dreams. By the time she awoke again, the sheets were tangled up and she felt like death. The only positive note was that it was Sunday and she didn't have to go to work. Not that she did anything useful all afternoon. Everywhere she turned, she was reminded of the disastrous evening with Mitchell. Her small carrier bag in the hallway had some cute baby clothes inside. The plan had been to take them over next time she saw Mitchell and Hope. But there was no chance of that happening now. The idea of never seeing Hope again almost reduced Emmy to tears. In an attempt to distract herself from endless self-flagellation, Emmy flopped on the sofa and watched a mindless film. Or she had been watching it until Mitchell had interrupted with a message on her answer machine. Now all she could do was stew again. Damn him. Why couldn't he have left her alone? Damn him. The street was teeming with pedestrians, but Mitchell barely noticed. His head was filled with work rubbish as he wandered past endless shops in the general direction of his bank. The day had dawned bright and sunny, but his mood had been a reflection of miserable winter, not optimistic spring. He still hadn't heard from Emmy, unfortunately. As the days passed, he felt more and more certain that she was not going to contact him. He had thought of ringing her again in the hope that she would answer this time. But, so far, he hadn't. The truth was that he hoped she would ring him that way. He would know she didn't completely hate him. Without realizing it, Mitchell found himself outside the cafe where he had originally met Emmy after Leah's death. It made him catch his breath for a second as he relived that awful moment when he heard the news. On an impulse, he swung in through the door as the spicy scent of coffee assailed his nostrils. He didn't have much time, but he needed a break anyway. So, it may as well be in here. The girl on the counter was a less abrasive version of the blonde from his previous visit. She smiled pleasantly as she took his order. Once the coffee was ready, he paid the girl and turned to carry his mug across to a window table. Emmy lifted her head from her newspaper. She stared in horror just at the moment their eyes locked. For an infinitesimal few seconds, they both froze. Was it fate had brought them here all over again? Well, Mitchell was not going to pretend he hadn't seen her. "Hi," he said brightly, as he sat down opposite her. "What are you doing here?" She asked bluntly. "Same as you probably, drinking coffee?" This wasn't going well. She seemed hostile and he wondered what he could possibly say that might help him make amends. "Sorry," he apologized eventually. She jerked her head up in surprise. "What?" "I said sorry. I feel like I've screwed things up and I never meant to do that." Emmy looked away and Mitchell felt his heart sink lower. It was blatantly obvious that she didn't believe a word of his apology. In all honesty, who could blame her? "It wasn't your fault," she said eventually. "I behaved badly too. I should have known better than to drink red wine." "You didn't behave badly." This was ridiculous. Why on earth was she blaming herself? "Yes, I did. It should never have happened. Leo is..." Emmy corrected herself quickly. "Was my friend. It wouldn't be right." Mitchell could see where she was coming from, but he felt she had it all wrong. "Leah isn't here anymore," he told her gently. God knew he was reminded of that every time he saw their daughter. "Blaming yourself for us getting together is daft. I accept that it probably shouldn't have happened for other reasons, and none of them are to do with you. But it did, and we need to talk about it. Last night was the most fun I've had in a long time. I enjoyed your company very much. As for what happened after, well, I didn't expect that to happen, but it did. And if I'm honest, it was pretty amazing." Emmy stared at him intensely. She seemed to be trying to decide if he was lying, but eventually she allowed a wan smile to light up her eyes. "Amazing, huh?" she said softly. "Amazing," he reiterated before reaching out and taking her hand in his. "I continue to blame myself for a lot of things," he said, "but last night is not one of those things. Irrespective of what happens next, I want us to remain friends." "If you want," Emmy replied nonchalantly. He still wasn't yet sure that everything was going to be okay, but, at least, she was talking to him now. It was a big improvement on the situation of an hour ago. He drank the rest of his coffee and glanced at his watch. "I gotta go, I have a meeting at 2. "Okay," she said. "I'll call you," he promised as he left. "Hope wants to see you soon." "And so do I," he added with a grin, as he jogged back down the street towards the bank. Emmy tried to concentrate on her work, but it was impossible. All she could think about was Mitchell and what was going to happen between them. Sure, they could be friends as he suggested, but would that really work? As she mulled it over, she found her thoughts drifting back to Leo again. Obviously, she had cared about Mitchell very much. Even a brief glimpse of the letters she'd found told Emmy that much. The question was, how had Mitchell felt about Leah? It was a subject they hadn't talked about, so Emmy had no real idea of how serious he had been about Leah. For all Emmy knew, Mitchell was some kind of Casanova who routinely seduced women and cast them aside when he grew bored. She didn't know him very well when all was said and done. How could she trust a word he said? If they saw each other again, and Emmy knew she would have to see him for Hope's sake, she was going to have to get him to talk about his relationship with Leah. She needed to know how he had felt about her friend. It wasn't as if she could sit down with Leah over a cup of tea and discuss things. No, she'd never be able to do that again. The figures on her spreadsheet blurred as tears formed. Emmy still missed Leah so much, but she had to move on, as, indeed, they all did, Mitchell included. When her phone blipped from her bag, she jumped in surprise. Wondering who it could be, she reached down to retrieve it. It was a text message from Mitchell, and she found herself smiling unwillingly as she read it. "Thanks for listening. I meant what I said. How about dinner on Friday? No wine this time." Emmy placed the phone on her desk and stared at it for a long time. She was torn. Dinner seemed too intimate and likely to lead to other things. But if she said no, he would take that as a sign that she was still upset and that she'd read more into their encounter than he had intended. Eventually, she tapped in a brusque reply. "Okay." His reply was immediate. "I'll call you later." Now, she was committed, but Emmy decided it would be a good opportunity to talk things through. There was no reason they couldn't just be friends. Once she had that thought clear in her mind, she returned her focus to work and set thoughts of Mitchell aside. Friday felt far off, and she had too much on her plate to worry about one casual meal. Her car was finally back in working order by Friday night, giving her a solid reason to skip alcohol. As she pulled up outside Mitchell's house, a wave of nervousness crept in. She sat in the car for a while, trying various breathing exercises to calm herself. It wasn't until she noticed how late it was getting that she finally stepped out. Being punctual was important to her, something her mother had always emphasized. Emmy had made a point to dress casually for the evening. Since this was just a friendly dinner, she wore faded jeans and an old t-shirt, making no effort to dress up. She didn't want to give Mitchell the wrong idea. The only reason she had come tonight was to spend some time with Hope. She was ready to build a friendship with Mitchell, and nothing more. "Hey," Mitchell greeted when he opened the door. "Looks like you managed to avoid the rain tonight," he joked. "Haha." Emmy grinned. "My car's finally out of the shop, so I got the full door-to-door service." "You could have had that last time if you weren't so stubborn," he teased as she stepped inside. Emmy let that slide and followed the sound of Hope's cooing into the living room. The baby lay on a colorful playmat, kicking her legs happily. As soon as she heard Emmy's voice, she turned her head, her face lighting up with a big, cheerful smile. "Hello, gorgeous. Look what Emmy has for you." Emmy reached into the bag she was carrying and pulled out a stretchy Barbie pink suit embroidered with cute bunnies. Hope waved her arms with enthusiasm and tried to grab the bag. "I knew you had excellent taste," laughed Emmy, as she quickly moved the crinkly bag firmly out of reach. "You shouldn't have," commented Mitchell when he came back in the room, a tea towel thrown over his shoulder. "It's only a little something I got in the sale." Emmy shrugged dismissively before she turned her back on him and concentrated on tickling Hope's toes. The tension between them was still there, simmering away in the background, like a keg of dynamite primed to explode. It seemed easier to focus her attention on Hope rather than deal with Mitchell. Mitchell folded his arms. He could see that it wasn't only a little something. The label quite clearly announced it had come from one of the expensive baby clothes boutiques in town. However, he wasn't going to risk offending her by saying that, so he let it go. "Before I go and finish off the dinner, would you like a drink or anything?" he asked. He had made a resolution, before Emmy arrived, not to say or do anything that might be construed as provocative in any way. "I'll have a Coke or some other cold drink, please," she said without looking up. "Okay, I'll go and have a look and see what there is," he replied, heading back into the quiet comfort of the kitchen. The moment Emmy arrived, Mitchell knew the evening might be more challenging than he expected. She looked relaxed and casual in her faded jeans and simple t-shirt, her hair pulled back in a ponytail with no makeup. There was a natural beauty to her, and it brought back memories he wasn't sure he was ready to face. He could tell she felt uneasy being back in his home. It showed the moment she stepped through the door. But for Hope's sake, if they were going to find a way to be friends, they had to work through the initial awkwardness. Still, it was hard to ignore how things had once been between them, or how the past hovered unspoken between them now. He hoped the evening would settle into something easier. Emmy heard the doorbell ring and glanced up, wondering who might be visiting on a Friday night. She was sitting in the armchair, with Hope on her knee. Though the sofa had a better view of the television, she avoided it. It reminded her too much of the last time she had been here and the emotions that had come with it. Instead, she focused on Hope, chatting gently as the quiet hum of voices drifted in from the hallway. A few moments later, the front door closed, and she heard Mitchell moving in the kitchen. She was about to go see what he was doing when he returned with a tray of drinks and some garlic bread. Need a hand? Emmy asked politely. Mitchell hesitated for a moment, distracted by the weight of the evening and everything unspoken between them, then shook himself from it. No, I'm all done, he said quickly, retreating to the kitchen once more. Get a grip? He muttered to his reflection in the window, trying to center himself before returning with the food. He stacked 2 plates carefully on top of the pizza boxes. Pizza? Emmy raised an eyebrow as he returned to the living room. Yeah, sorry, he replied with a grin. I kind of used up all my kitchen skills the last time you came over. She laughed, and he joined in, both visibly relaxing a little. Now, can I tempt you with vegetable or meat feast? Bit of both, please. Emmy smiled, suddenly realizing how hungry she was. The nerves from earlier had kept her from eating all day. Mitchell handed her a plate. They sat and ate in comfortable silence while Hope kicked her legs on the floor and music played softly in the background. Eventually, Hope began fussing, her quiet noises turning to louder cries. Mitchell sighed, setting his plate down. Well, I almost finished, he said with a small smile. I've got her, Emmy said, already standing. You sit down and enjoy the music. Before he could argue, she had gently scooped Hope into her arms, leaving Mitchell alone with the echoes of the past and a soundtrack of 80s rock in the background. Hope was lying in her cot, silently staring at the butterfly mobile that spun in languid circles above her head. Her eyes were beginning to close, but still Emmy didn't make a move to leave her. She knelt on the carpet stroking the baby's arms soothingly, whilst wondering how long she could stay up here, safe and out of Mitchell's way. Although Hope had been more than ready for bed, Emmy had taken as long as humanly possible to change and feed her. Apart from the fact that she had been in no rush to go downstairs again, she really enjoyed spending the time alone with Hope. In a strange way, it felt like she was close to Leah. She could almost imagine Leah with her, watching her from the edge of the room. She just hoped Leah hadn't been watching when she had seduced Mitchell the other night. That thought still made her feel incredibly guilty. Unfortunately, it didn't stop a sharp pang of desire from igniting, and she bit her lip painfully in an attempt to quell the unwanted feelings. The mobile ceased twirling, and Emmy saw regretfully that Hope was fast asleep. She knew she ought to go downstairs before Mitchell came looking for her, so she stood carefully. Hope didn't stir as Emmy left the room, quietly pulling the door closed behind her. When she entered the living room again, she saw that Mitchell was stretched out on the sofa watching a documentary. He turned when he heard her and said, You were gone for ages, did she make a fuss? Emmy crossed her fingers behind her back and replied, She didn't want me to leave her, so I waited until she fell asleep. Strictly speaking, it wasn't a lie. Hope was more than happy to have company while she fell asleep. He nodded. Sit down, and I'll make us a coffee. Emmy hesitated, and he noticed. Don't worry, I won't bite, he said dryly. She ignored the barb and sat down in the armchair again, anxious not be too close to him. When he returned with 2 mugs of coffee, she took one and said bluntly, We need to talk. Why you don't beat around the bush, do you? Mitchell said with a surprised look. Not as a rule, no? She sipped the coffee and tried to sort out her chaotic thoughts. Mitchell stayed silent. Evidently, he was waiting for her to make the first move. Eventually, she spoke. Tell me about Leah. Did you love her? Mitchell flinched. For a moment, Emmy wished she had kept her mouth shut. But then, she reasoned how would she know if their encounter was just another notch on his bedpost? Yes, he replied simply. He sank back onto the sofa, his brow furrowed with pain. I loved her very much. Then, why didn't you make the effort to be with her when you had the chance? Because of Hazel's illness. Emmy hadn't known this, and she felt wrong-footed. What was wrong with her? Hazel told me she had breast cancer. Our marriage had been over for a long time, but when she told me about the diagnosis, I couldn't just walk out on her. I decided to try again with her and stay to help her deal with everything. Of course, at that point, I had no idea she lying to me. Emmy stared at him in shock. What are you saying? She asked in disbelief. That she made it all up? Mitchell laughed bitterly. Yes, she'd concocted the whole story to keep me. I would still be in the dark if it weren't for a chance meeting in a supermarket. She was meant to be at the hospital for a checkup. I wanted to go with her, but she didn't let me. She said she needed to be alone. Unfortunately for her, this time she'd told me her friend, Claire, was driving her there. Only Claire just happened to be in the supermarket when I went in for some shopping. Emmy was struggling to comprehend the scale of the lie his wife had told him. It was like something off Oprah. Claire seemed rather surprised when I asked her how come she wasn't at the hospital with Hazel. She said she didn't know what I was talking about. So, I filled her in on a few things, and between us we worked the rest out. How did you confront Hazel? Emmy asked. His mouth curled in a caricature of a smile, but his eyes were stone cold. I waited for her to come home and go off on her usual spiel about treatment plans and medication. Then, I told her I knew she was lying. At first, she tried to brazen it out, but when she realized I'd spoken to Claire, the party was over. We had tears and recriminations. She blamed me, of course, said it was all my fault for having an affair, and what else was she meant to do? Mitchell buried his face in his hands as he recalled the screaming hysterics. It had been a horrible nightmare, one that he never hoped to live through again. But by then, it was all too late. Leah was long gone, and although I tried to find her, she had disappeared. I had to live with the loss every single day. God knows if I'd had any idea of how things would turn out, I would have done it all differently. But you didn't know, Emmy reminded him softly. No one knows what's going to happen in the future. Well, not unless we're psychic. He smiled faintly at her terrible attempt to lighten the moment. Why does it matter whether or not I loved Leah? Because I need to know if. Emmy turned away now, uncertainty creeping in. This conversation wasn't unfolding the way she had imagined. I need to know if the other night meant anything or if it was just a moment that didn't matter. Emmy, come over here. Mitchell patted the sofa beside him and gave her a serious look. Why? Don't be so stubborn. She felt as if they were on the edge of something significant, and that frightened her more than she expected. Still, she pushed aside her hesitation and moved from the comfort of the armchair to the unknown space beside him. Right, here I am, she said quietly, settling beside Mitchell, hyper-aware of how close they were sitting. Okay, just to be clear, I'm not someone who takes people for granted, he said sincerely. What happened between us, whatever it was, meant something to me. It caught me off guard, but I didn't treat it lightly. Now, if you'd rather leave it behind and move on, I'll respect that. Emmy didn't know what to say. The silence between them grew heavier, filled with unspoken questions and hopes. He had given her a chance to walk away, to pretend none of it had ever happened. She started, her thoughts drifting to Leah. He had once disappointed her friend. How could she be sure history wouldn't repeat itself? You scare me, she said at last. Mitchell's brow furrowed. Why? Because I don't want to get hurt again. He gently reached for her hand, and after a pause, she let him take it. If there's one thing I've come to realize, he said softly, it's that we have to be present. Life changes fast, and we can't always wait for the perfect moment. She nodded slightly. He was right. Anything could happen tomorrow. I won't pretend things in my life aren't complicated right now, he went on, but that doesn't mean I'm not willing to try if you are. I don't like complicated, Emmy replied, her voice uncertain. Then let's keep things simple for now, he said gently. They sat quietly for a moment, the air thick with unspoken thoughts. Emmy was conflicted, unsure whether she should be hopeful or cautious. Just as quickly as the moment had deepened, Mitchell leaned back slightly, looking at her with concern. If this is what you want, he said carefully, I just need to know one thing. What? She asked, her voice almost a whisper. Am I going to wake up alone again? Emmy gave a sheepish smile and lowered her eyes. I'm sorry, she murmured. I thought you'd think less of me for leaving. I'd never think that, he said gently. So, will you answer me? Do you want me to stay? Yes, I do. Okay. Mitchell stood and offered his hand. Second door on the left upstairs. I'll just lock up down here. He gave her a reassuring smile before stepping away. Emmy took a deep breath and headed upstairs, her thoughts racing. Butterflies fluttered in her stomach. Last time had caught her off guard. She hadn't had time to reflect. Now, even with her feelings, doubt still crept in. Was this another misstep? Mitchell's room was spacious and tastefully decorated. It felt so different from her own modest space. She walked across the soft carpet and paused by the window, listening for him. The lamps were off, but the moonlight offered a quiet glow. She gazed out at the garden, her mind drifting over the choices that had brought her here. This wasn't what she had expected for her life. After her last heartbreak, she had promised herself she was done with relationships. Being single had felt safer. Simpler. Leah had always disagreed. You just haven't met the right person, she had said with conviction. Trust me, they're out there. Yeah, sure, more likely they're locked away in some maximum security prison for life. Don't be so cynical. Leah had grinned. I promise, they'll appear when you least expect it. There had been something oddly certain in her friend's tone. Now, Emmy couldn't help but wonder if Leah had known something she didn't. Mitchell might not be the mythical Mr. Right, but he had reminded her that she was still capable of connection, of feeling something again. When he stepped up behind her and wrapped his arms gently around her waist, she let herself relax into his warmth. The tension she'd been holding onto slipped away. His presence was comforting, his touch grounding. She rested against him, breathing in the calm. They stayed like that for a while, a quiet moment shared between two people who understood, for now, what the other needed. Eventually, they moved to the bedroom and lay down together. There were no words, none were needed. His embrace was steady and secure, and she felt the anxiety of the day dissolve in the stillness of their closeness. They drifted to sleep that way, side by side beneath the duvet, wrapped in quiet understanding and the solace of human contact. The sun was hitting him square in the eyes when Mitchell awoke. He felt Emmy's warm body beside him, and he smiled. She had been true to her word and not abandoned him this time. For that, he was extraordinarily pleased. He was still acutely aware of the many reasons why he shouldn't have followed this road. But, after last night, he didn't care all that much. It had been too long since he'd enjoyed such intimacy, and he had missed it. For more years than he could bear to think about, his relationship with Hazel had been cold and distant. They had shared a house, but that was about the extent of it. Leah had been a shining light in a dark world, but fate had been against them. Until Emmy came along, he hadn't been looking for another relationship. Although Hazel had effectively left him, she still kept just enough of a presence in his life to make him hesitate about moving on. Technically, they were still married, and he didn't want or need the complications. But everything had changed. He suddenly realized he needed more out of life. Taking care of Hope had already pushed him to reevaluate his priorities. Work was no longer the center of his world. As much as he loved Hope, he knew that he also longed for companionship and emotional closeness. Emmy stirred beside him, and he smiled as she turned toward him, still half asleep. He reached out, gently brushing a few curls from her face. The sun caught her hair, revealing warm amber tones as she blinked up at him, a sleepy smile forming. "Morning," he whispered. "Hi," she said softly, her voice thick with sleep. They stayed like that for a few moments, simply appreciating each other's presence. Emmy let out a small laugh and stretched. "I can wait," she said playfully. "I'm not sure I can," Mitchell replied with a grin as he climbed out of bed, trying to focus on the day ahead. Later, Emmy pulled into Mitchell's driveway and turned off the engine, smiling as she spotted him waving from the study window. It was a bank holiday weekend, and they had plans to visit the seaside, weather permitting. Honestly, Emmy didn't care what they did. Spending time with Mitchell and Hope was more than enough. She couldn't remember a time when she'd been happier. Despite her initial reservations, her relationship with Mitchell had grown into something deeper and more meaningful than she'd imagined. The evenings and weekends she'd shared with him and Hope had been truly special. The fact that she was witnessing Hope growing up made it even more special. Leah's little girl was changing so fast. It seemed like every day she achieved a new milestone. Emmy couldn't have been more proud of her if she'd been Hope's mother. It didn't stop her wishing Leah could still be here, but at least it helped ease some of the pain. She grabbed her handbag and jumped out to retrieve her hold-all bag from the boot. Just as she was locking the door, a taxi pulled up and a tall woman stepped out. Emmy stared at her curiously, wondering whom the unexpected arrival could be. When the other woman turned to stare back at Emmy with palpable hostility, she suddenly realized who it was. "I take it you're his new woman friend," the woman spat venomously, as she strode up the driveway with a suitcase in tow. She managed to instill the maximum amount of insult into the words, thus implying that woman friend was a euphemism for whore. Her blue eyes were positively glacial as she looked at Emmy up and down. Emmy could feel her blood begin to boil in her veins. She was just about to toss an acerbic reply back when Mitchell flung open the front door. "Hazel," he exclaimed in horror. "What are you doing here?" "That's not very welcoming, darling," replied Hazel sarcastically. She turned her back on Emmy, making it quite clear that she saw her as inconsequential. "I received an email from Nadia 2 days ago, informing me of your new domestic arrangements. So, I managed to get a last-minute flight back," continued Hazel, ignoring Mitchell's furious expression. "Well, it might have been nice if you had let me know your plans," Mitchell said with great restraint. He could see the look on Emmy's face and wondered what Hazel had said before he opened the door. Although he knew Hazel would be back at some point, in his naivety, he had assumed she would give him some notice. That way, he could have prepared Emmy for the bitch that was his wife. He stood between Hazel and the hallway, praying that Hope didn't start wailing. "Which hotel are you staying at?" he asked pleasantly, waiting for her to kick off at such an outrageous suggestion. "What?" she spluttered in disgust. "This is still my home too. I'll bloody well stay here." "No, you won't. You may well be entitled to some of the value, but it's my home now. You forfeited all rights to live in this house when you took me for a fool. Or have you forgotten what you did? How dare you?" Predictably, Hope picked that moment to start screaming loudly, and Mitchell sighed inwardly. Emmy immediately came over and stood beside him, squeezing his hand. "I'll deal with her," she said quietly, before stepping into the house. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer first thing on Tuesday morning." Hazel threw one last acid-tinged glare at Mitchell, and then off she flounced, back up the driveway towards the taxi driver, who had been watching with an expression of great interest during the altercation. She negotiated with him for a moment, before climbing back in. In a cloud of fumes, the car shot back down the road before disappearing out of sight. Mitchell breathed a sigh of relief. That went well, he said to himself before retrieving Emmy's bag from the drive. Emmy was sitting with a snuffling Hope in the kitchen and cuddling the baby tightly. I think the shouting upset her, she explained softly. I'm sorry, he said to her, hugging them both tightly. I had no idea she was going to turn up like that. Hey, that's okay. Emmy could see how exhausted he looked. She knew he had been anxious about confronting Hazel, but at least now it was over. What happened next was up to her. Still want to go to the coast? He asked eventually. Yes, I think we all need some fresh air. Right. Let's get this show on the road, he said with determination. He gave Emmy a quick kiss, and she felt a rush of warmth in her chest. It was on the tip of her tongue to say those 3 little words that had been growing inside her, but she couldn't bring herself to say them. Maybe one day soon. She would have the courage, but not today. The gray sea crashed against the quay, sending spray high into the air. Seagulls flew overhead, calling out as they scoured the promenade for scraps of food from careless tourists. Emmy winced as the cold ice cream hurt her teeth, but she was determined to finish it. The rich chocolate flavor was exactly what she needed on a chilly day by the sea. Mitchell had decided to wait for fish and chips, but the ice cream vendor had won Emmy over. Sure you don't want a bite? She asked one last time. Not of that. No, he said with a wink. Emmy realized what he meant and blushed. Very funny, she laughed. You've got no chance tonight. Someone will end up hogging the bed. They both glanced down at an unusually quiet Hope, who was completely absorbed by the sights and sounds of the seafront. Her wide eyes were focused on the seagulls squabbling over a tray of discarded chips. Oh, she'll be out like a light, I promise. Mitchell grinned, and Emmy felt a smile tug at her lips. She won't be the only one, Emmy said. With all this sea air, I won't be able to stay awake. Then I'll just have to make sure you're comfortable while you sleep. Mitchell joked, pulling her into his arms and tickling her. She squealed with laughter, unable to catch her breath. Stop, she cried finally, and he relented. I'm glad we came, he said, as they continued along the path. Mitchell pushed the stroller with one hand while holding Emmy's hand with the other. Emmy silently reflected on what had happened before they left. Mitchell had stayed quiet about Hazel. Emmy had hoped he would bring it up during the trip, but he hadn't. Now, it was beginning to nag at her, and she needed to know where they stood. Being by the sea was a nice escape, but in 2 days, they'd have to face the fallout from Hazel's unexpected return. She stopped. What's going to happen between you and Hazel? She asked, without hesitation. Mitchell stopped and turned to face her. You don't waste time, do you? He said with a little amusement. His smile faded as the sun hid behind a dark cloud. What will happen is that Hazel will see her lawyer, who will try to get as much money from me as possible. I'm sure she'll use the fact that Hope exists to try and get as much as she can in the divorce. So, you are divorcing her? Emmy felt a sense of relief wash over her. Finally, her fear that Mitchell might repeat what he'd done with Leah had been put to rest. Of course I am. He grabbed her around the waist and looked her in the eye. Emmy, there's something I need to tell you, something I should have said already, but I didn't. Emmy looked back at him, nervous. What? I love you, he said simply. Tears welled up in Emmy's eyes, and she tried to wipe them away, but Mitchell held her hands tightly. Will you marry me once everything is sorted out? He asked. I might not have any money left by then, but we can live on love alone. Emmy laughed through her tears. You idiot. She sniffed. I love you. And yes, I'll marry you. They shared a gentle kiss, oblivious to the curious onlookers passing by. It wasn't until Hope, bored with watching the gulls, began shouting loudly that they pulled apart. Come on, said Mitchell. I think our daughter's hungry. Emmy smiled. He was right. Leah would have wanted it this way. 2 people she cared about most in the world, happy and taking care of Hope. From the midst of tragedy, Hope had been born. Emmy felt certain that Leah was watching over them and smiling. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.